So starting into this one, I do this. This is a Python Django example. I want to build an application when all is said and done that is essentially a standalone that you could sit down, walk through this code, have a pretty good framework for an application, and then extend it as you need. I'm going to try to make something that is moderately useful for everybody, and something that you can, there are better tools for it, but if you want a quick and dirty solution, then this would be it. Um, what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to get as far as I can. I don't think we're going to get really into implementing all these pieces, but we'll talk about them. So this is from scratch. We're going to create our application and talk about getting that in the database. I'm not going to code as I go too much. I'm really, because it is a somewhat fair amount of code. It's probably a couple hours worth of code that we're going to look over, but I'm going to walk through it and talk about some of the key things that, decisions and how we get there. And then of course, although I don't have it right now, afterwards, I will put it out I'll have it in a public GitHub somewhere so that you guys can take a look at it and you pull it down and play with the source code to your desire. So we'll create the application, focus on the database model in the background, set up our screens, tie the screens to the model, and then we'll talk a little bit about the back end process. But we're really those last couple items, we're really gonna flesh those out more in another session. We're just gonna try to set the table where we can for some of this time around. So start with the application, the database. We're going to call this monitor, and as the name of the application. You can call it whatever you want. But what we're going to do, I'm not going to show this. I'll show you sort of the results of it. Although we could, I'll probably run this one real quick anyways with a different name. But the way we start, and we've done this, talked about this before, the way we start a Django application, once it's installed, and we have examples of that elsewhere, so I'm not going to go back through that again. But once you have Django and Python in and ready to go, then you just run Django-admin, start project, you give it a project name. And as you'll see, it builds out some structure, a folder, and things like that. So you're off and running. You're essentially ready to run an application right then. You could, from there, start, and it'll spin up a little app for you. We're going to focus then on, since we're going to the database first, we're going to tweak the settings because we're going to go from the default SQLite that they have built in with it. We're going to flip it over to a MySQL database. We're going to point to that. We'll talk about creating the database and a database user, set those guys up in the settings, and then do a basic connection to it. Now, stepping back, the application itself is going to be, well, actually, I think I'm going to talk about the application as I look at the model. That may be a little bit easier way to look at it. So let's flip over. And let me do this. Let me take one of these. And actually, let me go with this one. And I'm going to blow this up a little bit for this first little bit. Blow this up a couple more times. There we go. So the first thing I talked about is we can do, if you want to create one, is you do a Django admin, start application, and give it a name. So I'm just going to call it monitor 2 for now. Oops, sorry, it's not start application, it's start app. Notice Django, actually, this is a nice little thing. Django's pretty friendly. And I've seen a couple other things like that. I think Ruby does this as well, where it'll help you out a lot of times. Hey, here, did you mean? And so it's like, oh, actually, yes, I did mean that. So it sort of guesses its way into stuff. So now I ran through that. And if I go to monitor 2, then it just created this monitor 2 database. And then it created an admin, apps, migrations, models, tests, views. And if I look at migrations, then there's really nothing in there, but it at least starts with that very simple structure. And so I actually can go in here, as I mentioned. Let's see. Whoops. Did I miss one here? Did it? Did I miss a file somewhere? Oh, wait. Well, interesting. It did not build. Normally, it builds a manage.py. And I'm not sure why I didn't get it this time. Let me check real quick. Start project. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not start app. It's a project. My bad. So I didn't mean start app. I meant start project. Let's do -rf monitor 2. This is why I tried not to do too much coding. We talked a little bit about apps before. Within it, you have projects, and then within those, you can actually have multiple applications. And so at this point, I've got a project, and it builds by default an app with the same name as the project, but I could actually add additional things, which we may look at some point, where we would do maybe a front end, a back end, an API, things like that. But now I'm going to keep it simple. So once I've built it, it's built a fairly simple couple of things. It's got some settings, some URLs, not a whole lot that it's built, but I can go in and I can do a run server. And it's running. It's going to tell me we've seen this before. It's going to tell me that there's some database migrations because I have not set up the database. But then if I go out here somewhere, then I can see, and I'll blow this up a bit. I can see where, okay, it's, I'm running my Django server. It's got links. Whoops, let's put this here. So like this a little bit. And it's got links. So I can learn some stuff about Django if I wanted to, or, for here, this is just basically to say, hey, I've got this built. So now I'm going to flip over to some code here. So one of the first things we want to do is we have to create our database. And if I can find where here we go. So one of the things is, first thing I do is I'm going to call this database monitor. And this is a little bit getting into the MySQL side of stuff, but just so you know, it's creating a database is very simple. You come in, log into MySQL, say create database, name the database, boom, done. You have a database. It's not going to have any tables really of use, but you've got a database you can work with. In this case, I actually go in and I create a user, and this is got a nice little case issue there. I create a user for this database, and I'm just going to call it MON owner for the monitor owner, and I give them a password. And I need to do it. I'm going to do it for whether I'm on local host or, if it recognizes me by some sort of IP address, and then I'm going to grant all the privileges. And so what this does here is creates this user mon owner, and then I get all the privileges that I need to be able to administer the monitor database. So if I wanted to jump over to my monitor database, actually I can say, so here, so once I create it, I'm going to log in as mon owner, and then I have the monitor database and I'm able to start working with it. So the first thing I've got to do, because I'm going to not use the SQLite that Django provides, is I have to make sure that there's a database I'm going to connect to. Django will not create the database. That has to be there. And I need to make sure I've got a user, because once I have my user and password, that allows me to connect to that database. In order to do so, I have to jump into the settings, in which, let me do this real quick. If I look at monitor 2, there is a settings that is generated from start. Some of these files we're going to talk about, actually, we create them. They're not created from scratch, but just so you notice, this is one that is, and most of this information is in here. There's a lot of, as I talked about, the Django friendliness. There's a lot of comments around what are we doing? How do we set this stuff up? what do we need to do? And with our settings right now, the first step we're going to do is we're going to come down and we're going to find a section on database. And by default, let's look at this real quick. By default, this may be a little hard to read, but by default, the engine's going to be SQLite, and it's going to connect to a little SQLite database, which you can see. I think it actually creates it somewhere in there. Or maybe that's one. Yeah, so it's already created a little database there, the SQLite, so that you can actually work with that. You could, if you didn't want to use MySQL, you could go right in and you could start using SQLite right away. We're switching gears a little bit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come in and set it up and say that we want to use the MySQL backend. We give it the username of what, or the name of the database, the name of the user we're going to connect with, and the password. There is, as part of setup, you may have to install using pip, which we've talked about in the past. You may have to install the MySQL client. We covered that in previous discussions, so I'm not going to rehash that. And then once we've done that, then as that being, once we've set up the database and connected to it, so we can connect to it, then all we need to do, and I'm going to do this in the monitor 2 cents just to sort of see it. Is then we can come in and all we do is we do a Python, run it against manage, and we can do make migrations. I'm not sure if it actually, and then we give it the application name or project name. Whoops. Oh, and it's going to say no installed app, because the one other thing we have to do at this point is we have to add our application to installed apps. For some reason, when it creates one, it doesn't do this, but this is going to be your name, your application name. So here I would have to go into the settings for monitor 2 and change it over. So I'm not going to mess with that too much because I don't want to get too deep into the code. But what we'll do is you do make migrations. And so let's flip over to monitor. I wonder if I can blow that code up a little. Nope, I can't blow it. Oh, there we go. Let's blow that up a little bit more. So in here, I can do Python 3, if I spell it right. Python 3, manage. If I do make migrations, it will go through and make some, but there are no changes detected because I've actually run this. And then you can do migrate. So in your case, the first time through, there's not going to be much, there aren't going to be any migrations the first time. We're going to make our model, and then we would run make migrations, and then we run migrate, and it's going to update stuff. In this case, I can see where there's this admin, auth, content types, and sessions. Those actually all are supplied by Django. And then monitor is my application itself, and I don't have any migrations at this point. So if we were to run all of these, then we would be able to run our application, and we wouldn't get that warning that we got way back here that said, go back here. Oh, I'm sorry, it's over here. We wouldn't get the little warning here that says you have unapplied migrations. So if I run it on monitor 2, where I just saw that I don't have migrations that haven't applied, then I just get a straight, it checks a couple things, gets itself set up, and then boom, it's running. So let's go over to, because we're focused on the database, let's flip over to the models. And shrink that down a little bit. Now, models is one. Let me go back to here. That is not included. So, when it's first built, we'll create this models.py. And it's one of these names that it's going to be looking for. I think we may see it here. I think there's a note on that somewhere. Oh, no, it's not in here. So we're going to go in, and models is basically where we're going to source our information for our database. As we saw when it attempted it, there was a couple different applications, auth and things like that, that were supported by, provided by Django. Well, this is what we're going to provide with our application. So models.py within an application is the model for that application. So one of the things we have to do is we've got some imports we've got to do from the start. And basically this is DjangoDB and the contrib auth models. Actually, really you just need import models. But what we're going to find is that when we start using, if we use security, or if we use, well, really it's security stuff, or if we have dates, we have to import some additional pieces. So I have those up there, but really this first one is what matters, because we're going to see every one of our models. If you remember, this is how we do inheritance. So this LKP ping, or lookup ping, inherits from models.model. And that tells the system in the back end that we're going to be creating a database based on that. Now, what we're going to do in this case is we have one, and this is where I'm going to start talking about the application itself that we're building this time. We're going to drive this off of one primary table, and it's sites. And what a site is, what an entry in a site is, it is a web address. Could be a site, could be as far as like a website. It could be an API address. It's just pretty much anything that we could, any URL. So it may be a straight address. It may have a port number. It's whatever it needs to be. And the reason we're going to provide that is because we are going to have that as an address where we can do some sort of essentially a heartbeat or a ping or something like that of that site to see if it's up and working. Now, the reason that we've got, so we've talking about these columns now in these fields. So each site we're just going to have, which we just sort of talked about, we'll have a name, a description, and a link. I don't know why I have that image like that. Shouldn't be there. I thought I got rid of that. So we're going to call it a URL. So we have a name, a description, and a URL. And this is so we can identify what the site is, and also this address so that we can reach it. Now, note that we have character fields. So name and description they're just text. One's 50, one's 250. So the name, we're going to keep it sort of small. And the description, we're going to let it get a little bit longer. And then the URL, we're actually making this a URL field. And so that tells Django that it's something, it's got some additional validations and things like that. I'll try to get that so it doesn't pop up. It's going to do some additional validation and have some basic widgets and things like that we can use for it. Last check is just a date. And within that, we are going to, that's the last time that we did a check. So we're going to, do periodic heartbeats essentially. And ping is going to be, this is going to be a lookup. We've got 3 lookup tables. And each of the lookups, I guess I'll jump to that real quick. We're keeping it very simple. They just have a code, a name, and a description. Really, the name is user-friendly. The code is essentially going to be the primary key. Although each of these has an ID field in the background, we're going to use this code as our primary key for looking up values and instances, records within each of these lookups. And we have the ping, which is essentially what type of heartbeat are we going to do? Is it just a get? Is it a ping? Is it a get where we're going to actually check the value, the responding value? It could be a put, something like that. So we're going to have a couple of things that we're going to be able to support. And we'll start with very simple, and we'll be able to extend as we need to. Result is what kind of result we're looking for. And this gives us essentially a type that will be easy for us to check against so that we can say whether it's a failure or not. So the result could be a failure, or it could be that maybe we got a 200 code or a 400 code or some sort of a value returned back. And then we can also check that value to make sure it's the right value that was returned. And then frequency has to do with how often we're going to be able to we're going to want to do these heartbeats. We could do it a certain number of minutes, a certain number of hours, certain number of days. And so if we look at, so that's our ping is our type, is how are we testing to see that, what are we doing to verify that this site is alive, essentially. We have a desired result, which is basically saying what results should we be getting back. It may be result value as well. So maybe we get a 200 as a desired result, but or essentially what we're going to call whatever we name that. But there also may be a result value. So, for example, an API call where maybe you send it a specific call and it needs to send back a specific value or string or something like that. And then, so frequency, type, and frequency is, are we going to do this? Are we checking every minute or checking every certain number of minutes, certain number of hours, certain number of days? And then the frequency is that number. So if my frequency type is minutes and my frequency is 5, we're going to check every 5 minutes. And I've just got some basic audit stuff of when the record was created and when it was last updated. Most of these we've covered in the past. We have foreign key relationships for those lookups. Most of this is text. We do have a couple of dates and some integers, but nothing terribly interesting here. We do have our URL field. And then all of our lookups are essentially identical. Maybe note that we have the toString. We do this because since these are going to be lookups, when it does a lookup, the value that we see in a selector is based off of this string function. So we're going to make sure we go off of the name as opposed to the code or the description. Description could be a bit lengthy for a dropdown. And then in the site itself, if we want to list the sites, we're just going to go by the name. We're just going to keep that very simple. So that's our model. And then we can go in, once we've built this out, then we would go in and do our make migrations and then migrate. And at that point, we will get a database. I don't know if this is, I can't blow this up too much, but hopefully you can see here within this, if I can go, let's just blow up. I'm sorry, I can't get this any bigger. But essentially what I've got here is I've got a list of tables that it generated. I can see, remember I talked about that auth application? Well, the table names, in case you have forgotten, the table names are prefixed by the application name. So these are the auth related tables, the ones auth underscore. I've got the Django related ones, which is the admin and the session stuff. And then monitor is my app. And I can see where I have my sites table, my lookup result, lookup ping, and lookup frequency. And actually, since I did just delete a column out of this in my model. Let me make sure I've saved it. We can actually, that gives us an example to play with a little bit. So now I can go in, if I do make migrations, then it's going to go in and it recognizes here that I removed that field IMG link from sites. And then if I migrate, it's going to execute that. And so it applied this monitor remove sites image link. And if we look over on, we've got a migrations folder and we can see each of the migrations. So I can see here, this is my initial. So I came in and it created the model for lookup frequency, ping, and result, created my initial sites table. And then I came in and I tweaked, I think maybe I added a result value. I came in here and set a couple of properties around a few of these fields. And then I come in here and it's going to come in and remove field image link, which I just did. So I can actually see my entire history of changes to my database as well. Let's see, I think, let me go back and make sure. And then just for grins, we'll go ahead, here. I'm going to run this. I can find my run server line real quick. There we go. I'll close that out. Oh, I'm already running it. I'm sorry, I'm running it over here. And let's just make sure we close it and reload it. And from that, now I'm going to see, now I've got a couple other things here, but Now my site is up and I want to actually flip over to the admin side. If you remember, because this is sort of somewhat for free, we've got, and I'll show that in a minute, is that because we built this, we can actually see on the admin side, we can see our tables. Groups and users is in there by default. Frequencies, I can see what the frequencies are that I've entered. I can look at ping types. I can look at result types. I can see some sites that I've already done. I can add those. So I can do all of this through the admin, but we're going to have a front end. And as a reminder, the authentication and authorization, that's an application that it's already built those into this admin side. Monitor, I had to add them. And I had to do that through admin.py. And that is one that I'm pretty sure I have to create. Let me double check that just to be sure. Yes, I do have to create. By default, it does not have an admin.py. But if I want tables to show up here, then I need to do this, which is pretty simple. I have to import the admin from Django contrib, and that says that I'm hooking, I'm connecting to the admin app essentially, and that's what that admin is. And so for each of these, and I'm going to pull my models since I did it for all of these guys. So I'm going to do lookup frequency, ping, result, and sites, all 4 of them. And then with each one of those, all I'm going to do is create a class that inherits from the model admin for each of those. I get a display, a list of columns that I'm going to display, which is here on the list. So I can see name and URL. For these, it's going to be name and code. And you can see that name, code, name, code, name, code, name, URL. If I wanted to add another column, let's see, if I think like lookup result, I think is a field there, then I can add that. Actually, let me go look at my model real quick. Oh, it's not up. Let's see. Well, let's just, let's do last. Yeah, let's do last check. So if I do last check over on admin, then I'm going to see it's going to do an update, which it did. And now if I look over here, sites gives me the last check field as well. So I can play around with that as needed, but I can fairly, as we've seen before, I can pull these things into the admin. And then all I have to do, so I create the class that is essentially the admin model form based on this. I mean, all that behind the scenes, Django knows what it needs to do. And then I just register. I just register each of them and basically just say, what I want to call it and, or what the model is, and then what the admin class, essentially the form class is. So I can pull those guys in and I'm ready to go. So that gives me my database. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about, let's see, we've sort of gone into the model. I sort of skipped ahead to this a little bit, but that's okay. So just summarizing that a little bit. Primary table is sites table. That's where we're going to list our information. We've got some lookup tables that are basically just support tables for that main table to give us an easier way to enter data. We do need to create a super user, and we're going to talk about populating tables and fixtures next. So creating a super user is moderately simple. You just say, let's see, I think I have it specifically. Otherwise, I may have to look it up because I always forget, even though it is rather simple. Where did I put that? I don't have it. Okay, I think it is. I think it is just, let's do this. I think it's just called, create super user. So what I have, I've already built, but let's say I want to go into monitor, and actually let's do it this way. Let me go, oh, there we go. Go back over to monitor. Now, right now, if I look in my, got to keep that running. So let me look at my users real quick. Right now I have a user named Rob that I created. So that's my only user. And this user is, has a staff status. So it's, basically it's a super user. It's active and it's staff. If I want to create another user, so let me create, I'm going to create a guest. Then that's create super user. So I've got that. All I have to do is just say create super user. It's going to ask me what the name is. And so I'm going to call it guest. I give it an email address, give it a password. I think it doesn't like super simple ones, but let's find out. Yeah. So if it's too common, I try to use password 123. And it'll say, you can bypass the validation if you want to, which I'm going to, because I don't need to worry about it. So now I will be able to look in here. If I refresh, whoops, I got to start my server back up and then refresh. And now I can see that I've got guest user. And again, I can see that they're active, they're staff, they're super user, but I'm going to go in and somewhere in here, delete. And we talked about these users and permissions and things like that in the past. So I'm not going to rehash that too much, particularly because it's not going to matter too much for our application. Now, one of the things that we need to do is we're going to need to enter in these lookup values to some way, form, or fashion. Now we've got this interface that allows us to fairly easily do so. It's user friendly, good user experience. But I do want to mention something we've done in the past, or that we haven't really covered in the past, which are fixtures. And those allow us to, along with the data migrations, we can use those to develop on one machine. And remember, those migrations are SQL scripts. So I can go run those same migrations. I can run those on another server and update it fairly quickly. What migrations don't do is handle data. That is where fixtures come in. Now, what a fixture is I can take a look at a table. For example, let's do, I think, results, because I don't think I've done that one yet. Let me go look real quick in my folders. Where did that go? Here it is. So I did frequencies before. So for results, instead of me having to update my database and go do this again, I can actually do a dump. And that's where fixtures come. Whoops. Let me do it this way. That's where fixtures come in. And so all I need to do with that, and I'll show you what a fixture looks like. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do with manage. Again, we're using this Python 3 manage. We do a dump data. We give it the application name, and then we give it the table name. So this time I wanted to do look up result. Yeah, look up result. You can give it an indentation because it's basically for pretty printing and things like that. And then I'm going to put it into the fixtures folder, and I'm going to call it results.json, because it's going to generate a JSON file. So I'm going to do that for result. And I'm also going to do it. I did it already for frequencies, but I'm going to go ahead and do it for pings. And then we'll take a look at those, because then what I can do, okay, so I've generated these. And now that's I use dump data. Load data is the reverse of it. And all I do with that is I just tell it what fixture I want to use. I tell it the app and the table. Yeah, it's very much a similar kind of command. And it'll actually it'll insert that information into the database. So I'll do that in a second here. So let's look at these first. So let's look at results. If I look at my data, I had failure, value response, is alive, and simple response. I had these 4 items. When I created the fixture, then it creates just a nice little JSON structure for each of those records. It tells me what the model is. So here's my app and my table, what's the primary key, what are the fields and the values, and then it just does that for each of those. So I can also do that for ping. I can see where I've got it for my ping values, and I can see it for my frequencies as well. Now note that it has the model within. So technically I could just combine all of these, the data from all these tables into one shot and try to pull it in. Um, but it's easier to keep track of doing it separately. So there's some advanced things you can do if you have to pull like an entire database and want to do that through Django, as opposed to the databases, bulk load and backup and features like that. But for now, we'll keep it simple. You can do it on a table by table basis. And what I can do is, and I'll show an example of load data. So I'm going to do the frequencies. So if I go into my database and look at frequencies, here's my data, and I'm just going to get rid of all of the records in there. So I've emptied my table. I think it's okay with that. I didn't like that for some reason. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, because this has got foreign keywords. Oh, because I've already got a record in there. So let me get rid of my site. Come here. If I can double click properly. There we go. My mistake. I forgot that I had already had a record there. So if I come into frequency now, I can take all of those, get rid of, oh, let's do it this way. I'm gonna come back and do it. There we go. Okay. So now I've emptied those out. But now if I wanted to come in and load it, look up frequency, right. Oh, probably have the wrong, I think I called it look up. Oh, what did I call the fixture? Let's go look at that real quick. I called the fixture frequencies.json. So and so now it installed 4 objects from one fixture. And if I go back and look at my data, I can see where it installed each of those. It went ahead and pulled those guys in. So I could do that on another database. If I wanted to take this application and quickly migrate my entire database, including data, then I can use those fixtures. They are also useful from testing and things like that. There's a lot of different uses for it. The built-in test system actually makes use of fixtures behind the scenes. So this just gives us a good way to move data back and forth. So that gives us a way to create our model, create our data, and back it up, move it around. So that really is that second working session. So now let's switch gears into the front end. We're going to talk about our screens for our application, or our pages. And we're going to keep this sort of simple. We're going to have a home page. There's going to be some base navigational stuff, like a base menu. We've got a header and a footer for our pages. We're going to talk about it. We're going to have a style sheet that we're going to use for our application. We're going to pull some stuff in there. And then we're going to have a screen that allows us to add or edit a site. One other one we're going to do is we'll have a, which is essentially going to be sort of the home page as well, is we're going to have a list of our existing sites. So to do this, we're going to create some more files and fill these things out. And this is where there's going to be a lot of code I'm going to go through, but I'm going to try to walk through it somewhat quickly because it is moderately repetitive. So hopefully you guys will be able to easily take a look at that. When you pull down the code, if you want to build your own example, then it should be easy to read and modify. So we got a couple of things that are key, I guess, to building a page. We have to have a URL. We have to give it an address. We have a view, which basically says, hey, when I get to this address, this is what I'm going to do. We're going to build an HTML template because it's sort of as a, jumping the gun a little bit here, but when we build out a view, at some point we're going to display something, which is going to be an HTML page maybe with a form within it. And as part of those HTML pages, we're going to have a template, which is going to be sort of basically we're going to be storing our header and footer, things like that in there. And then we're also going to talk about our style sheets so that we can give it a general look and feel. Let's see. So we jump over here. So let's start with our URLs. Let's see. We can close a couple of these down a little bit, simplify a little bit. Let me close a couple of these off. So start with our URLs. Now, URLs is actually generated. You have some by default. So I'm just going to do a cat monitor 2, oops, monitor 2. By default, there's very little that it gives, and that little is the admin site. If you remember when I fired up monitor 2, I was immediately able to flip over to the admin site. And that's because it's built that /admin. If I do anything else on it, then it's going to tell me that it can't find it, basically. And I think we have seen that before. You will see an example somewhat like, do I have that running in the background? I do not. Let me run my server again and I'll show you an example. If I come in and give it an address that it doesn't know what to do with it, it's going to say, hey, so I'll just call it mistakes. If I try to go to that page mistake, it's going to say page not found, and it's going to show me this is what is actually defined within the URL. So these are the patterns that I register, that I recognize. Now notice I'm seeing this because I have debug equal to true in my settings file. If I change that to false, I'm not going to see that. I'm going to get a standard 404 page. So while we're working on this, while we're developing, debug on, we're going to or equal to true, you're going to get a lot of useful information. This one, for example, I don't know how many times, even building this little application where I had a typo or something like that, and I could easily say, oh, here's what I'm looking, here's what I sent, here's what oh, wait, this is what I meant to send. And so I can correct that, and then it'll direct me accordingly. Now it includes the admin and by default, and that's the only import path, which is this the patterns we're looking to match. I'm keeping them very simple. You can actually get more complicated with your patterns. You can do regular expressions and things like that, but I'm going to keep them simple. One of the things I'm going to do is from monitor, my application, I'm going to import views. So it's going to go find views.py, which we're going to go fill out here in a little bit. And from the Django piece, I'm going to include because that allows me for the user authentication piece that I'm going to use. I'm going to go ahead and include in accounts. And then I'm going to have, so /account, which I could be, this could be users, could be a lot of different stuff, but I'm going to hang off of the accounts URL address, all of the URLs that are the auth related URLs, which are things like login and log out, things of that nature. So that's more of a security thing that's built into Django. So we're going to take advantage of it. And then we go to our pages. We have our home page, which is just going to be our default now. So if we don't give it if we just go to the site, it's going to jump to our home page. Sites, which is going to be that's going to be a list of the sites that we've entered. We're going to be able to edit a site by giving it an ID. We're going to add a site if we don't give it an ID, and then we're going to have a user registration page. And so those are our URLs. And so now we have homepage, list sites, edit site, add site, and user register that we have to build out in our views. And so as we flip over to our views, a lot of this stuff is going to come as we go. So there's a couple of these I can actually eliminate out. I don't use time zone. But I'm going to leave these in here anyways for right now. And this will be stuff that, again, you'll get the code and you can fairly quickly, I think you'll see what you need and what you don't need. And like I said, Django's pretty friendly. So when you try to run something and it doesn't see something it's expecting, it will say, hey, I can't find, such and such a library, which usually will imply that you then need to go and import that library, or do a from. Now, let's just sort of walk through our pages from the viewpoint of view. Um, I'm going to come back. We'll look at some of these HTML things here in a little bit. This is the logic behind it. So for home page, we're going to come in and we're going to see if the user is logged in. If they are, we're going to go to welcome.html. So they're going to get a welcome page. Otherwise, I'm sorry, if they're not, they're going to go to the welcome page if they're not logged in. If they are, it's going to go to the list of sites. And notice one, it's going to render. So it's going to say, all right, I'm going to kick over and render the HTML page. This one says, instead of going to slash, just slash as your home, it's going to redirect me to /sites, which is going to go to the sites page. So if I start here and I'm logged in, it's going to redirect me to sites. So it's going to go to this list sites call. And that's just and just within this, it's going to do a quick redirect. And now I come into list sites. So we're going to take a look at that one, which is sort of it's our homepage for people that are logged in. If they are authenticated, in this case, so if they're logged in, so if they try to go to the sites page and are logged in, then it's going to get all of my site objects or site records out of the database. There's no filtering. I'm going to set up a parameter of sites, which is that list of all records. And then I'm going to render the site list and I'm going to send it the parameters, which happens to be the list of all sites. If I'm not logged in, it's going to tell me to go log in. And I can see that here. I think I am logged in. So if I go to sites, it takes me to my sites. If I log out and go to the same thing, then it's going to take me to my welcome page. And we'll take a look at how these things got built out here in just a minute. So that's list sites. Another page I'm going to put together, and notice I just kept all of these secure from the start. So if you're not, let's see, if you're not logged in, it's going to send you to the login page. So all of these, if I try to go to like site, then it's going to ask me to log in. If I try to go directly to any of those, and then I can log in and get it. So real quickly, I mean, I didn't have to really build much to this, is just this accounts login. If you remember, that was included from the auth piece here. Accounts. And then I added all of the auth URLs. So one of them is account/login. And so I go here and I can see that that's my login. So once I go for edit site, that's going to take an ID. This is the only one that's taking a parameter. So it's going to be, so if I do site/1, and this is this is with the slash, it's not a query string parameter. So for example, if I do site/1, that's going to try to get me something and it does not exist. I don't have any sites right now. If I do it as a query parameter, that's different. So I'm not saying ID = 1. In that case, it's going to think that I didn't send anything. So it's going to try to add a site because that's not a query string parameter. That's an actual part of the URL that we are addressing here. Since if I just give it a query string version, then it thinks that it's this because it gave me site plus a query string. So edit site, if I give it an ID, it's going to say, it checks to make sure if it's not 0. So if it's an ID that's not 0, then it's going to go try to find the data for that site. We saw what happens if it doesn't. You get a 401 says, hey, I can't find that. Otherwise, if it's a 0 as an ID, it's going to create a blank record. Which basically works identical to add, but I did it this way. So it's a little more ponderous approach. If we post to this site, so if I'm doing an update and posting, then I'm going to grab the data from my form and I'm going to see if my form is valid. And then I'm going to go ahead and save. And then once I've saved my record, I'm going to go back to my list of sites. And we'll take a look at this in action a little later here. So I come through for edit. I will create a blank form, which I did here. So it's from site form. We'll take a look at those in a minute. I'm going to send my ID across, and then I'm going to have a title for the page that I'm going to use. And then this is going to call site edit.html. For add site, it's very similar. I still call site edit. Basically, the only difference is I just come in and create a blank form. I don't ever do the here where I'm trying to grab an object from the database based on the primary key. And so, two other things. I went ahead and I've created a logout that I can call, and the user registration. User registration is so we can actually create a user within our application. And that's a form that we'll take a look at. We've got a registration form, and there's a registration HTML. That's just some additional administrative pieces. You really don't need to log out, the register, or even to check the authentication. You could just say, I'm just going to let whoever hits this application see everything. So I built these. And one of the things I want to do now is go for my views is we've referenced these forms all over the place. Forms are the application version of the model. Now I've got a couple forms that I'm basically stealing from Django, which is user creation form and user. And those are so I can do the registration and the user login. So that gives me a really easy way to create and administer users. Those pretty much you're just going to use what what comes. You can see there are certain fields that you can require or not. You can make some tweaks to it, but that's sort of outside the scope of what I want to cover this time around. I do want to look at my primary form is the site form. And within that, it is based off the sites model. And I'm going to give it my list of values that are going to be on my form. For each of these, I'm giving them with labels. I'm going to give them sort of some pretty labels for them. And we'll see these in a minute. And then there's some widgets that I've got here to allow me to do input. Most are pretty simple. I've got text where I'm limiting the size. And I'm giving it a class. This is a CSS class in case I wanted to play around with that. And then I've also got a text area. So text input, single line, text area. I have multiple rows here. So I'm going to do 2 rows of 80. It probably should actually be 3 rows because I have a 250 limit on that one, I think. And then that's pretty much it. And then a number input. So those are my forms. And so now I can go to, let's looking at our views. Let's take a look at the HTML side of this. There's 2 things. One, first we're going to add a static folder, which has to be addressed in settings. And that's where we're going to put like our JavaScript, our CSS, images, things like that. So those will all go in our static folder. And then by default, we get a static URL. And then all we have to add is that where our static files directory is. So I'm calling it static. So it's just off my base directory for my application with static. This OS path join is a operating system generic approach to combining values to give you a path for the hard drive, for the local drive. So it takes care of things like backslashes versus forward slashes and things of that nature. And again, this is stuff where not a whole lot you need to do other than just know that it's out there. And once you've got it, once you've Googled it, you throw it in there and boom, you're ready to go. Now within my static, I pulled down the bootstrap files. I think we've seen this before, so I'm not going to go dig that up. And this just happens to be because I'm going to use bootstrap. I do, although I don't need to use this blog guy. I'm not actually using him anywhere. So I'll just move him to trash. Within the CSS, one of the things that Bootstrap gave me is the form helpers JavaScript. Monitor CSS is my application, and then I've got these images in case I need them. Now, static comes in use when I go to my templates. So templates is where it's going to look for HTML stuff. So when I go to a view, and I look, and when I say, create register.html, then it's going to try to look for that within the templates folder. And so I have site edit, which I've created here. And now with each of these, so let's start with our welcome. It extends base.html. So this is built on top of base HTML, which I'm going to look at in a second. If you remember, we have blocks. And so we have this content block that is going to be part of this HTML. Before that content block, it's going to go pull in base HTML. Base HTML is our generic format for a page. We're going to load the static files. So everything that's within that static folder, we load it. And then a lot of this is like here, static. We're going to pull in our Bootstrap stuff, both the CSS and the JavaScript. We've got the form helpers one. We've got some jQuery JavaScript that's pulled in for Bootstrap. Pulls in another little JavaScript. And now we pull in, one of the last things we do is, and all of these are sort of your standard link for a style sheet, href, and then I'm going to give it within static CSS monitor gives me, whoops, and I just accidentally hit that, pulls in my CSS. I create a header, which I'm using. This is a pretty standard Bootstrap navigation. In effect, it gives us this little thing here, which also is responsive. So as I shrink it down, it gives me my little hamburger menu. So I do that to give me a nice little responsive interface. Let's see, I set up my menu items, which is just basically a home. And then if you're logged in, I'm using some, this is still Django. So I can say if the user is logged in, if they're authenticated, then I'm going to allow them to have add site and log out. If they're not authenticated, then they're going to be asked to log in. So they just get home and log in. So if I log out, I just get home and log in. If I log in, I get home, add site, and log out. And then I have my content block, and I'm wrapping that in a div that's going to be of class content. We're going to see that with our style sheets a little bit. And then I have at the bottom, I have a footer, which is going to be of the standard footer class. And I've just got some basic text for that. At the very end, pull in some additional JavaScript, which I think, did I already have that one? Bootstrap, yes, I did. I pull in some JavaScript that I actually push that stuff to the bottom just for speed. And so it comes in at the end and then finally comes in and pulls in JavaScript that it needs. So that gives me our base. So I've got a footer, I've got a header, and then I've got my content. So if I look at welcome, there's a header up here, this content block, and then there's going to be a footer underneath it. My content block, I've got JavaScript included here, which is very simple for my on clicks. So I can log in and register. I've got a little text. And so I can see that right here. Oh, I'm sorry. That's actually not it. This is the welcome. So I can see I've got my login button. I've got my register with the site, got login, register with the site, register. I do not have one of my templates set up, so we're not going to look at that right now. Oh, I'm sorry. I can fix that real quick. It's not called external. It's called base. And I think that will give me all I need. So now, yeah. So now I can do user registration. So I could add a user if I wanted to. It gives me some help for each of these. What is it, as far as your username, your password. And it's a very straightforward here. Let's see. So I do, if you guys remember, I bring in the registration form. And let's go look over here real quick for user register. So I'm using this registration form, which I pass in. I pass the form as form is the parameter. I'm going to pass that into register.html. And so I can come in on the register side and I can do a form, and I can either, there's three ways I can do it. I can do it as a list, as an unordered list, as paragraphs, or as table. If I want to do a table, I can change that real quick. And it's going to be a series of rows. And if I do that as a registration now, it looks more like a table. I get to the end. After the table, if you remember, I have to send it a CSRF token, because I'm going to be, if I'm going to do data entry stuff. And then I have my submit button. And then I've put this together, and I've also got my little helpful text. You can also log in if you have an account. Log in, bam, bam. And so I've built my header, which is the navigation. I've got my footer, which is down here, which is also very straightforward. And then this is my content. Now you may see that I've got my nice little coloring for that. That I picked up with my CSS monitor. If you remember, I used a class content for that main block. And so with each of those, I've just come in and I set a width, which is 90%. I have it centered basically because it's got a padding to the left of 5%. So it just kicks it over 5%. I also take the text within it and push that over 5%. And then I've got my background color, my forward color, and then my height is just 80%. So it just sort of limits it. So it's a nice little small screen, very early 90s look. And it's also responsive. So it doesn't look too bad as it shifts stuff around. Now that is, so if I want to add a site, so that's my welcome. Site list is what I'm looking at here. This one's a little more complicated. I've got an if here. So if the user has a first name, then it's going to say sites for that user. Otherwise, it'll say my sites. And then I've got my add a site button, which just takes me to add site, which is right here. Otherwise, I'm going to say if I have, let's see, so if sites, which is, if you remember, that's the list of the records from the sites table. If that has some entries, then it's just going to be a for, so for site and sites. So for each record, I'm going to call it site. And then I'm going to come in and build out a listing of those, which we'll see that in just a second. And then I do an in for. If I don't have any, then it's just going to say no sites entered, which I have here. Click on add a site to get started. And we'll take a look at this second. I've got each of these displayed. There's going to be a CSS class site, which we're going to look at in just a second. So let's create a site. And this again, oops, let's look at that real quick. Create a site. I'm doing a form as table. And I used that site form that we use here. So I'm going to see site name, description, test URL, ping type, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to see all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to, it's going to display that out. I sent the table or the title, which is either add or edit. And then I've got to save changes. And then note, I've also got my CSRF token, so I don't have to worry about cross-site issues. So I'm going to add a site. I'm going to do it. This is the DP homepage, heartbeat, the ping type, and I just had a couple, so I'm going to do a heartbeat. The test URL is https://developpreneur.com. Desired type is going to be is alive. Desired value, I don't have to worry about that because if is alive is just going to be a response. And I'm going to do this every 5 minutes. And so I'm going to, that's my heartbeat check. I'm going to do save changes. Now I get to see a list of sites, which is, whoops, site list. And so here, this is where it's going to, for each record within there, it's going to do an MD5 and an MD1, which we can sort, there we go. As it gets smaller, the 5 is actually, because of the size of the screen, it gets funky pretty quick. But normally what I'm going to see is if I have multiple rows, let me add a second site. Let's see, I'll do my this one real quick. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna do a heartbeat. I'll go straight to that page. Simple response. Well, it's gonna be is alive. Don't have to worry about that, and do that once an hour. Save changes. So now we can see two sites together. Each of these, I've cleaned these up a little bit, and I can either edit or, nope, I didn't have an on click. So if I wanted to edit one, then I can come in and I can edit that page. From this, so let's take a look at that from the CSS point of view, because this is something we're going to want to play around with a little bit, I think, to make our applications more useful. And because of the power that Django gives us, it makes it pretty easy for us to clean this stuff up and well, we can use CSS anywhere. Apologies. So here, I'm sorry, so we're gonna go over our CSS, and I wanted to step into this a little bit just because we haven't spent much time on it. So if we look at our, what did I call that? I called that site. So here's my class. And I can do quite a bit with this. As you can see, this is a moderately lengthy CSS entry. And with this, I'm doing things like I'm setting the radius. We can see as I hover, I get my little background. It has a sort of beveled kind of look. And I found the easiest way for us to play around with this stuff is actually through pretty much any of your modern browsers. If you want to change a look and feel, then you go up here. So like here, I'm selecting, it's hard to see. I know this is very small text, but I'm selecting this item. So I'm going to select a site. And then over on the side, I'm going to be able to actually see what is the CSS that's being used. And I can start playing with this live. So I can change my background color. Let's say instead of that gray, I want it to be red. Yeah, that's pretty ugly. But I could say instead of the text color, the one that it was, I want to change it to be, I don't set the color there. But whoops. Let's see if I can add a color real quick. Shoot, I can't because. Okay, there we go. There we go. So if I do color white, then I can change that. I can also change around my padding. So I can go from 25 to 30. Or I can drop it to nothing and see that now my padding's been moved over. I can work with my margins. So I've got a bottom margin here. I've got a little bit of space. I could get rid of that. I could start cranking up the, and within the padding. So now I can like really tighten some of this kind of stuff up. I could increase the font. I could decrease the font. Whoops, that's not decreasing the font. That's decreasing the font. And then the quick way to play around with stuff is play around with it live. And then you can just copy and paste and just take all of that, copy it out of there, flip over here, and I could make that part of my CSS, and boom, I'm off and running. Now that hits, I know we haven't gone too deep into this, but that does give us at this point an application that we're entering some stuff. I've got some basic CSS. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a future session. We can enter some data, and that leaves us the next time we come around actually with this information to build a backend that actually is going to do these checks based on pings and things of that nature. So what have we covered? We went through the basic app creation, actually basic project creation, and that included creating an application with it. We looked at forms, we looked at our model, views, URLs, went through some nice basic stuff. put our application together that way, looked at setting up our CSS and actually including that in. And it's, again, much like any other web application, you're using the same kinds of commands. It gets down to its JavaScript and HTML. Talked a little bit about some troubleshooting kinds of things as far as, having debug turned on and being able to play around with that, and using our Django environment for things like backing up our data and importing it into others. Of course, doing our migrations and things of that nature. So questions and comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's all more reason I'd love to see if I could use this Django to monitor one of my apps. Maybe not write the code in Python, but do some monitoring and just basic operations. What you've shown here in Django, just for how easy it is to set up. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely an ancillary application. It is actually a really solid solution for that. So and I know you've spent a lot of times building, like utilities and things like that. Those applications and little executables and that we have to build, or we don't have to, but we usually end up building because we want to be more productive, because there's things that we find ourselves doing all the time and we want to automate the task or simplify the task or do it in a way that somebody that's not us, that doesn't have maybe the deep knowledge of the core application, that they can do stuff, that they can, do some administration or do some reviews or reports or things like that. And the more I play around with it, the more that I find that both the Python itself, and because of it's so lightweight and so uh, pervasive as far as environments and things like that. And then Django, if you want an interface for it, it's a really good pairing for doing those kinds of applications. So good point. Glad that you're seeing the usage as well. Other questions and comments? If anybody's talking, they're on mute. Otherwise, go ahead and move forward. So that brings this session to a wrap. I had hoped to get further into it, but just as I've started looking at it and some of the things I wanted to cover, this is definitely going to have to be a multi-part session. We've got the bulk of it. We've got actually we have a functional front end. I think this would count for like a minimally viable product from the front end point of view. We'll do a little bit of tweaks to it, and then we'll come back and swing around to the back end next time around. As always, want to appreciate your time. Thank you for listening in, for checking this out, for comments and everything else. If you have any other questions or anything else that you need to contact us, you can always catch us at email, info@developernoor.com. You can go out to the contact us form on developernoor.com. We have a YouTube channel that you can go. If you go look for Developernoor from YouTube, then you'll find it and you can subscribe. And we put stuff out twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays right now. We've been a pretty steady schedule for the last year, so I'll probably maintain. Vimeo is not as frequent as what we've put out from the YouTube side. We more often will put things like these mentor classes will show up at Vimeo first, and then eventually they'll show up on YouTube. And then if you want to keep us from the podcast point of view, you can always check out the Better Developers podcast or Developer Nord podcast. It goes by both names. For example, if you have Alexa or something like that, say, Alexa, enable building better developers, and it'll start playing the latest episode. And just some of the ways we have to communicate to you guys and ways for you to communicate back to us as we work together to try to make every developer better. So go out, have yourself a great day.